This is the image they tried to bury. A wall of NATO flags, 32 of them, fluttering outside Allied Command Operations headquarters in Brussels, and directly beneath them, a Canadian maple leaf flying at full mast alongside the Danish Dannebrog, the British Union Jack, and the German tricolor. As of 9 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, Wednesday, February 26, 2026, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has effectively chosen sides, and it did not choose the United States. For the first time in the 77-year history of NATO, the military alliance built by American power, funded by American treasure, and guaranteed by American blood has launched a coordinated defense operation that is explicitly designed to protect Allied territory from the implied threat of its own founding member. Operation Arctic Sentry is live. Canadian warships are deploying to the Northwest Passage. Danish F-35s are flying combat air patrols over Greenland. British carrier strike groups are surging into Arctic waters, and the President of the United States is watching his entire geopolitical strategy implode on live television. This is not a drill. This is not a diplomatic communique buried on page 16. This is NATO activating its command structure, cohering military assets under Joint Force Command Norfolk, and telling the world that the Arctic will be defended collectively against all threats. Sources inside the West Wing say the president is apoplectic. He spent the last 13 months threatening to annex Greenland, mocking Canadian sovereignty, and treating NATO like a protection racket he could shake down at will. Now the alliance has called his bluff, and the timing could not be worse. We are talking about a Supreme Court that just struck down $175 billion in tariffs 6 days ago. We are talking about a House of Representatives that voted 219 to 211 to repeal his Canada tariffs 2 weeks before that. We are talking about a president whose signature economic policy has been declared unconstitutional, whose own party is fracturing on the floor of Congress, and whose closest military ally just deployed warships to protect a neighbor he threatened to absorb. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how NATO outmaneuvered the White House. We are going to explain the financial catastrophe unfolding from the Supreme Court tariff ruling. We are going to show you why Canada's pivot to Europe and China represents a permanent rupture in North American relations. And we are going to answer the question nobody in Washington wants to ask. Has the United States just lost the Arctic? Buckle up. The post-American world order is being written this week. To understand why NATO moved now, you have to understand the slow-motion catastrophe that began in January 2025. Remember Trump's Greenland obsession? It started as rhetoric. He wanted to buy the island. Denmark said no. Greenland said no. The entire international community said no. But Trump does not hear the word no. He hears negotiating leverage. By December 2025, he had appointed Jeff Landry as an uninvited special envoy to Greenland. The Danish foreign minister called it completely unacceptable. By January 7th, 2026, Trump told the New York Times, and I want you to hear this carefully, that the only thing stopping him from taking Greenland by force was, in his words, his own morality, not international law, not NATO obligations, not the sovereignty of a fellow democracy, his morality, his mind. That quote sent shockwaves through every chancellery in Europe. Then came the tariff escalation. In August 2025, Trump raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%, up from the original 25% he imposed in early 2025. By January 2026, he was threatening 100% tariffs, a full economic blockade, if Canada dared to sign a trade agreement with China. Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, did not blink. He signed the deal. He stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 20th, 2026, and delivered what analysts are now calling the most significant speech by a Canadian leader since Confederation. He called the rules-based world order a rupture, not a transition. He called on middle powers to unite against economic coercion. He never said Trump's name. He did not need to. The next day, Trump stood at the same podium and said, quote, "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark." Here's the chain reaction that followed, and here is what the mainstream media is not connecting for you. Within 48 hours of that exchange, Trump rescinded Canada's invitation to his so-called Board of Peace. He threatened the 100% tariff. He told the world that Canada would be devoured by China. But Carney had already anticipated this. According to sources inside the Canadian Privy Council office, Ottawa had been quietly negotiating with NATO allies since October 2025. The plan was simple but devastating. If Trump continued to threaten Canadian sovereignty, either through annexation rhetoric or economic warfare, Canada would invoke the spirit of Article 4 of the NATO Treaty, the provision that commits members to consult whenever the territorial integrity or political independence of any party is threatened. They did not formally invoke it. They did not need to. The message was delivered behind closed doors, and every Allied capital heard it loud and clear. But here's the catch. The military mechanics of Arctic Sentry tell a story that the press releases do not. This is not a symbolic gesture. Let me explain what is actually deploying. Joint Force Command Norfolk, NATO's newest operational headquarters, is now the nerve center for all Allied military activity in the Arctic and High North. This command was originally created to secure transatlantic sea lines of communication. It is now being repurposed to coordinate a multi-domain defense posture across the entire circumpolar region. We are talking about Danish F-35 fighters flying out of Keflavik Air Base in Iceland. We are talking about Swedish JAS-39 Gripen jets flying NATO air policing missions for the first time since Sweden's accession to the alliance. We are talking about German Eurofighter jets deployed to the North Atlantic. We are talking about the British Royal Navy's HMS Prince of Wales carrier strike group surging into Arctic waters, the most significant British naval deployment north of the Arctic Circle since the Falklands era. And we are talking about Canada's Operation Nanook, a year-long series of military exercises across the Northwest Passage, Yukon, and Nunavut, now formally integrated under the NATO umbrella. The Canadian Armed Forces announced on February 19th that they would conduct operations throughout 2026 to detect, deter, and defend against threats across all domains: land, maritime, air, cyber, and space. Lieutenant General Steve Boyven, commander of Canadian Joint Operations Command, said it explicitly. Canadian sovereignty is inseparable from a strong and credible Arctic defense. That language is not accidental. Sources inside NATO headquarters say the Arctic Sentry planning documents were drawn up with input from Canada and specifically designed to address the security vacuum that Trump's rhetoric created. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said it publicly at the Arctic 360 conference in Toronto on February 11th. She wants Arctic Sentry to become permanent. She said, and this is the key quote, "Canada's role in NATO has historically been one where we export our defense to Europe. It is the moment in time where NATO must look north and not only east." Now, here is where the situation moves from military posturing to constitutional crisis. Because at the same time NATO was deploying warships to protect Canadian sovereignty, the Supreme Court of the United States dropped a bomb on the president's entire economic strategy. On February 20th, 2026, in the case of Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs was illegal. Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative appointee, wrote the majority opinion. He was joined by Gorsuch, Barrett, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. Only Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh dissented. Roberts was devastating. He wrote that two words separated by 16 others in IEEPA, regulate and importation, cannot bear the weight of the president's claim to unilateral tariff authority. He said that when Congress grants the power to impose tariffs, it does so clearly and with careful constraints, and it did neither here. He invoked the major questions doctrine, the same legal framework the court used to strike down Biden's student loan forgiveness. The message was unmistakable. The same court that said Biden could not forgive student loans without explicit congressional authorization just said Trump cannot impose tariffs without it either. The financial carnage is staggering. According to the Tax Foundation, the IEEPA tariffs had already collected more than $160 billion from American importers. Over the next decade, they would have generated an estimated $1.4 trillion in federal revenue. That revenue stream just evaporated. And here is what nobody is talking about. Those tariffs were not just a trade weapon against Canada and China. They were a cornerstone of the administration's fiscal plan for the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, the massive tax and spending package that passed the House by a single vote. Without tariff revenue, the math does not work. The deficit projections explode. The bond market, already nervous, starts repricing risk. Your 401k, your pension, your retirement portfolio, they are all caught in the blast radius of a policy that just got declared illegal by the president's own Supreme Court. It gets worse. Trump's immediate response was to impose a new 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a law that allows temporary tariffs for up to 150 days during balance of payments emergencies. Legal scholars are already calling this a ticking time bomb. Section 122 was designed for genuine monetary crises, not as a workaround for a Supreme Court loss. Multiple lawsuits are expected within days. The administration is essentially playing whack-a-mole with the judiciary, slapping new tariffs on every time the old ones get struck down, and each new legal authority they invoke is thinner than the last. This is the death spiral of an economic strategy built on executive overreach, and every time a tariff gets imposed, paused, modified, or struck down, American businesses lose confidence. They freeze investment, they delay hiring, they pass costs to consumers. The Tax Foundation estimates that the Section 232 tariffs that remain in effect will cost American households an average of $400 in 2026 alone. Combined with the chaos, the real cost is immeasurable. Let us push the scenario to the extreme and talk about what Mark Carney is actually building while Trump is fighting courts and losing congressional votes. Sources inside the Canadian government say Carney has spent nearly 60 days abroad since taking office, pursuing what aides describe as the most aggressive trade diversification campaign in Canadian history. He has signed 12 new economic and security accords in 6 months. He has opened a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, a direct diplomatic counter to Trump's annexation threats. He traveled to China and negotiated a tariff reduction deal that opens $7 billion in new agricultural export markets for Canadian farmers. He is in active discussions with India, ASEAN, and Mercosur. And here is the move that has Washington truly terrified. Carney is attempting to link the European Union with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. If he succeeds, he will have created a trading bloc of nearly 1.5 billion people that explicitly excludes the United States. Think about that. The president who promised America first is watching America get cut out. The entire architecture of Western trade, which the United States built after World War II, is being quietly dismantled by a Canadian economist who used to run the Bank of England. But here's the psychological dimension that makes this truly dangerous for Trump. And I want you to understand this. Trump's entire political identity rests on the projection of dominance. He is the deal maker. He is the strong man. He is the man who bends the world to his will. But in the last 30 days, the Supreme Court told him he does not have the power he claimed. His own House of Representatives voted to repeal his tariffs, with 6 Republicans breaking ranks. NATO deployed warships to protect an ally from his rhetoric. Canada signed trade deals with his adversaries. And the international community rallied around a Canadian prime minister who stood at Davos and said the rules-based order has ruptured. Trump responded the way he always does. He threatened. He posted on Truth Social that any Republican who votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences. He called the Supreme Court justices unpatriotic and disloyal. He said he was ashamed of certain members of the court. He tried to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $6 billion infrastructure project connecting Detroit and Windsor, because Canada owns the toll revenue. This is the behavior of a cornered leader. History teaches us that cornered leaders are dangerous. Now let us talk about the base, because this is where the political calculus gets truly terrifying for the Republican Party. The MAGA faithful see the tariffs as economic patriotism. They see Canada as ungrateful. They see NATO as a money pit. When Trump says Canada lives because of America, they cheer. But the coalition is fracturing. The 6 House Republicans who voted to repeal the Canada tariffs, Massey, Kiley, Bacon, Hurd, Fitzpatrick, Newhouse, they represent agricultural districts, border districts, trade-dependent communities that are hemorrhaging money under the tariff regime. Don Bacon told reporters, and this is remarkable, that Canada has been a good ally and has been unfairly attacked by the administration. Thomas Massey invoked the Constitution itself, arguing that tariff authority belongs to Congress, not the executive. These are not Democrats. These are conservative Republicans who see the legal and economic writing on the wall. And behind them, according to sources on Capitol Hill, there are dozens more who agree privately but are terrified of Trump's wrath. Bacon said it explicitly. People feel like they are between a rock and a hard place because they do not want to get on the bad side of the president. That is not a governing coalition. That is a hostage situation. What does Putin see when he watches this? What does Xi Jinping calculate? They see an American president who cannot enforce his own tariffs because the Supreme Court says they are illegal. They see a military alliance that just deployed against its own leader's rhetoric. They see a Canadian prime minister building alternative trade networks that bypass Washington entirely. They see a House of Representatives in open revolt over trade policy. The projection of American power depends on the projection of American coherence. When the sheriff of the international order cannot keep his own house in order, the wolves notice. Russia has significantly increased its military activity in the Arctic, reopening Soviet-era bases, establishing a new Arctic command, testing novel weapons systems. China is mapping Arctic shipping routes and investing in polar infrastructure. The irony is staggering. Trump said Greenland needed to be protected from Russia and China. NATO agreed. And then NATO protected it from Trump. So how does this end? It ends at the intersection of three collisions that are happening simultaneously, and none of them has a clean resolution. Collision one is legal. The Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, but Trump immediately pivoted to Section 122. That authority expires in 150 days. The legal challenges are already being filed. FedEx has already sued for a refund of tariffs paid. The government has collected over $130 billion that may need to be returned. Justice Kavanaugh warned in his dissent that the court's decision opened a can of worms on refunds. The Treasury Department does not have a mechanism to return that money. The fiscal implications are enormous. Collision 2 is political. The House vote to repeal Canada tariffs now goes to the Senate, where 4 Republicans, McConnell, Paul, Collins, and Murkowski, already voted to terminate them last October. If the Senate passes it, Trump vetoes it, and the cycle of confrontation continues. Democrats have unlocked a procedural mechanism to force more tariff repeal votes on Mexico and the Liberation Day tariffs in the coming weeks. Every vote is a public fracture. Every vote is an ad for the 2026 midterms. Collision 3 is geopolitical. Arctic Sentry is now operational. Canada wants it permanent. The military infrastructure being built, the command structures being established, the interoperability being developed between Canadian, Danish, British, Swedish, Norwegian, and German forces, these do not get unwound by a tweet. This is institutional architecture. This is the kind of alliance building that takes on a life of its own. This is not just a trade dispute. This is not just an Arctic exercise. This is the stress test of the American-led international order. The founders of NATO built the alliance on a simple premise that democracies defend each other. They built it because the United States retreated after World War I and the world burned. They built it so that no leader, no matter how powerful, could bully an ally into submission. Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 4 says you consult when sovereignty is threatened. The question hanging over every alliance meeting, every encrypted cable, every classified briefing is this: what happens when the threat to sovereignty comes from within the alliance itself? The answer, as of this morning, is that the alliance adapts, it bends, it restructures, and it quietly, diplomatically, but unmistakably draws a line. The line runs through the Arctic. Canada is on one side. Greenland is on one side. 30 allied nations are on one side, and the President of the United States, for the first time in history, is on the other. We are in uncharted waters. The maps are useless. The old assumptions about American leadership, American reliability, American coherence, they are being rewritten in real time by a Supreme Court ruling, a congressional revolt, and a military alliance that just chose to defend its members, even if the threat wears an American flag pin. Watch the Senate. Watch for the tariff repeal votes in the coming weeks. Watch for the Section 122 legal challenges that will land in federal court before April. Watch the Arctic, where Canadian and NATO forces are now conducting continuous operations along the Northwest Passage. Watch the bond markets, where the disappearance of $1.4 trillion in projected tariff revenue is about to collide with a deficit that was already spiraling. And watch Truth Social, because the storm that is coming from the Oval Office will not be a tweet. It will be an executive order or a purge or a constitutional crisis that makes everything we have discussed today look like the opening act. For one man in the White House, watching NATO deploy against his vision, watching his court strike down his policy, watching his Congress break ranks, watching his closest neighbor build alliances with his rivals, this is not a political setback. This is an identity collapse. Trump built his brand on winning, on dominance, on the idea that America bends the world, not the other way around, but the world just bent back. The Arctic is being defended. The tariffs are being dismantled. The alliances he tried to break are reforming without him. And the question that will define the remainder of this presidency is not whether he can recover. It is whether he can accept that the walls have been breached, or whether he burns the house down trying to prove they have not. NATO has chosen. The court has ruled. The House has voted. The Arctic is being defended. And Donald Trump, the man who said only his own morality could stop him, just discovered that institutions, alliances, and constitutions can stop him too. Subscribe. Stay close. The history books will not be kind to this chapter, but they will be written this week, and you are watching it happen in real time.